Today's topic, I wanted to share one of my most favourite things to look at in an astrological chart, which is essentially looking at the life cycle of a planet. So we often have like the world's mythologies to be able to try and understand the nature of a planet. And we have the elements and modalities and rulerships to be able to understand what a sign means and what a planet in a particular sign means. And I think looking at cycles just adds another, I guess, more 4D dimension to all of that, because it adds this kind of dynamic interpretation that can be used in chart delineation, knowing where a planet has come from and where it's going, as opposed to just a static planet in a chart that we look at in a 2D chart. And I want to focus on the interpretive principles today. Today, we're going to be looking at two different types of journeys. I like to call them journeys, and I kind of see them as two mythologies in themselves. And one is the journey or the template of the superior planets, that is this planet of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. They all share a similar cyclic journey with the sun. And same with Venus and Mercury, they have another version, like they're taking a different path, for example, with the sun. But they both are consistent with each other. So we're going to go through that today and what it means to see these planets in their respective places of their respective journeys and what that means in a chart. Now, I'm not going to go through the astronomical meanings, astronomical journey as per se, but I just wanted to show you basically some overarching thoughts that I have about them. And this is by no means a deep exploration of this, but this is essentially when you do, if you're aware of it or know the research, this is the journey of the superior cycles. It starts and ends at the same place, which is where the cazimi or the conjunction with the sun occurs. And it gets through all of the different Ptolemaic aspects until it completes its whole journey again. So we have the beginning, end, and the middle. And the Mars journey takes just over 2 years. The Jupiter journey takes over 1 year, and the Saturn journey takes just over 1 year again, okay? And the way I like to look at this is that the first third of a planet in its journey is like a youthful, fairly naive version of that planet, okay? So if Saturn was in that first third of that journey, I would interpret Saturn and try and imagine what a young Saturn would be like, okay? And then from at the middle third of that journey, this is what we call the Chronicle Phase, where it goes through the retrograde cycle. This is where I see that planet going through a major ordeal of that particular 1 year or 2 year journey, depending on what planet it is. And then when a planet is in the evening phase, in that last third of its cycle, I see that planet as being more mature and experienced. And this is some of the concepts that I use to interpret a planet in that stage. And you can use the animate function of solar fire. I only use solar fire, so I'm not sure about the other programs, but the animate function of solar fire to be able to help you determine where that planet is on its journey. And and right at the end, between the start and the end and the beginning of the new synodic superior cycle, we have this kind of changeover, and that's kind of determined by the planets being in the beams around the sun, and that's a big we'll spend a bit of time on that section there today. And this is the interpretive, overarching interpretive ideas I have about that planet is that it's in a process of decay. Things are breaking down and things are changing, but there's renewal depending on where that planet is in respective to the sun. So these are some interpretive overarching principles that I use. And likewise, the inferior planets, they both share a similar journey together, but very different from the superior cycles. So with the inferior cycles, which is Venus and Mercury, they also start and end at the same place. And the main difference between the inferior cycle and the superiors is that the inferior planets don't ever get to that opposition point. So rather than being midway through their cycle and having an opposition, they would then come back to another conjunction with the sun on the superior side, on the outside of the sun. So it's further away. And these little details can be understood if you read Demetra George's book, or I can go into more detail next week at the VAA. And the other unique thing about the inferior cycle is that it has this concept of the maximum elongations, the point at which the planet moves furthest away from the sun before it turns back towards the sun. And it's 28 degrees approximately for Mercury and around 48 degrees for Venus. So they're the key differences between these two journeys that we're going to look at today. And so when I see an inferior planet in before its maximum morning elongation, I consider this to be a very youthful and naive Venus or Mercury. When we look at the planet from maximum morning elongation to coming into the beams, I see this as still a youthful planet, but yet maturing to a degree. Then when it gets to the other spot where it comes into the beams of the sun, this is the big challenge and ordeal of that cycle. And when it rises in the evening after being seen through that ordeal, I see this planet as being in their prime and empowered. And after the maximum evening elongation back to its new cycle, I see that planet as being a more mature and wise planet. Okay. And likewise, as with the superior planets, that changeover from one cycle to the other is an archetypal process of decay, change, and renewal. So I just wanted to just show you my overarching thoughts as to how I see that cycle. Okay, so let's jump straight into an example to illustrate this. And this is the chart of Elon Musk. And as you can see, I don't have a time for Elon Musk, but this is one of the beauty of this technique is that you don't necessarily need a new time, an exact time. So what I like to do is, and so for this presentation, I'm really only going to be focusing from Mercury to Saturn. The moon has a different journey of its own, and that could be another workshop in its own entirety, okay? So what I like to do is imagine a line going through the sun, and for that line to be like a pretend horizon line. And that orange arrow there shows the diurnal motion of the planets that they're traveling through. So if the sun is at the descendant at the western horizon, the sun is actually setting, and we can see that everything to the left of the sun, which is Mercury, Moon, and Jupiter, are all evening stars because they're setting after the sun, okay? Whereas Venus, Saturn, and Mars, they're going to move in their diurnal direction, and they're going to be rising on the east before the sun, and they're considered to be morning stars, okay? That's all pretty straightforward. I would also observe the fact that Mercury is about 8 degrees apart and separating from the sun. So it's coming up to an evening rise, okay? Whereas Jupiter is coming up to a trine with the sun, but it's retrograde. So I know that if we know the journey, superior planets that are trine to the sun on the evening side are about to come out of its retrograde motion. And Venus is on the morning side, and it's a bit harder to eyeball, but I do have a Venus ephemeris I'm happy to share. But Venus, it has made its maximum elongation, so she's now applying back to the sun. So that's all telling me information as I glean the chart. And Saturn, it's a morning star as well. And as you can see, it's just shy of making its first Ptolemaic sextile aspect with the sun. So it's only just started its 1-year journey, and it hasn't even made this first aspect. So it's considered to me to be very young. And Mars, you can see it's also around the trine mark of the sun, but it's direct. So if you can see superior planets at the trine point on the morning side, and it's direct, you know it's going to turn retrograde. And in fact, on closer observation, it does turn retrograde when he is 12 years old, okay? And Jupiter turns direct in 26 days after its birth. So this is the summary of what I would look at in a chart, that this is probably about a Mercury rise at birth, considered to be a Mercury rise chart to me. It's, within 6 days of one. So Mercury is moving into its prime and empowered phase. So it maybe suggests to me Mercury rules the mind, so maybe strong mental faculties, intelligent, and it's rising into great visibility. So whatever this person does with their mind is going to be seen, sooner or later. Whereas Jupiter, it's at the end of its great ordeal, the great challenge. So what happens when we've been through some hardships is that we are a bit more wiser, and maybe in this case we see Jupiter as emerging wisdom, or maybe emerging wealth, or emerging leadership as a result of having been through hardships and challenges. Mars, because it's about to head into that ordeal phase, I see this as Mars about to engage in a big battle of its life cycle. So it's like Mars about to confront the dragon. So this Mars might be very much more courageous and risk-taking and energetic, much more so than a Mars that we would see at the evening set, okay? Saturn, it's very youthful. It hasn't made its first aspect yet from the sun. And so if you imagine what a young Saturn might be like, I would imagine it to be very enthusiastic in planning and organising, maybe a little less rigid than a Saturn that's a bit older, but also maybe less patient than a Saturn that's older. Okay, so these little nuances inform me a lot about what the natures of these planets are doing. And Venus is youthful but maturing in its phase. So this is just in the lead up to her great ordeal in a cycle. So she's entering a stage in life that's about to get really serious. So she might be a Venus that may take risks in relating, or she may be more self-driven and self-centered and less considerate of others than what we archetypically know of Venus, okay? So just a summary, today we're going to go through these interpretive principles. The shared ones between the two cycles are one of orientation, the visibility and the direction of the planet. But specific to the superior cycles is the notion of the curtailed passage that we meet at the halfway point of the retrograde cycle, and the fact that they have a morning rise and an evening set. But on the other hand, it's only Venus and Mercury that have a morning rise and evening set, as well as a morning set and an evening rise. So we talk about what the differences are there, and also the fact that the elongations are specific to Venus and Mercury only. So that's kind of like the boring part, like taken out of the being over and done with. Is there any questions before I move into some of the interpretive concepts and chart examples?
We have a question here from Janine saying, I'm a little bit confused. Does the birth time / rising sign make a difference with the cycle?
Not really. If we're just looking at cycles, this is really just looking at where planets are at in their orbit with the sun. But obviously we want to look at the birth time, because this cyclic interpretation will only add to the interpretation of the planets in their signs and houses, okay? And we will go through some examples later, because for example, if we look at a transiting Saturn that's about to go retrograde, which we had a couple of weeks ago, we then want to look at, okay, what house ruler is it? And, where are we heading into a big ordeal for that particular house topic, okay? So that's just the next step in extending this concept, but today we're focusing purely on the fundamental concept of the life cycle of that planet. So hopefully it that clarifies things for you. Yeah, obviously birth time's very important. But if you didn't have a birth time, this is one way you can get some information from the chart. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question here.
Yep.
Dan asking, can you go into a bit more detail about how we understand if a planet is on the rise, how they go into retrograde in 12 days, etc.? A bit more detail about the calculation.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying before about needing to learn the astronomy of it. And I refer you to Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, Volume 1, for in chapter 21, she has a very concise explanation of describing that journey. And I will be teaching a longer version of this talk next week at the Victorian Astrologers Association. So you can always tune into this, but I'm just mindful that we don't have much time in this talk and that people might be more interested in the interpretive principles. And you can essentially get retrogrades by looking at the stations on, say, solar fire. You can get the rise and sets times and we will go through like rise and sets, how many degrees from the sun, etc. So this will partly come into it when we get into the interpretive principles. Okay.
Thank you. We have a couple more here. Andre is asking, Ptolemy says that Eastern to the sun is stronger. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you're just about to find out. We will go through, yes, true in some cases, theoretically. So, and obviously this is all open to our own observation as well. And I'll share what I've observed and maybe some of you could share what you've observed too. So morning star planets, right? So I've just listed some keywords, which you can, I guess, read, but I wanted to sort of share some of the, what some of the texts say about this, that when Eastern, or when in the morning, Dorotheus of Sidon talks about stars making matters manifest. So they're more tangible in our lives. They're stronger in that matter. And Paulus of Alexandria talks about it being more effective and active, but from their youth rather than being active later on in life. So that was, I thought, an interesting observation. And on the topic of electional astrology, Saul says that planets that are rising in the morning, it will be strong in that inception. Okay, so it does kind of suggest that planets in the morning are strong, but there is a caveat to that, which I'll go to in a minute. Helena Avila also has an amazing book on the heavenly spheres, and she talks about the morning planets being more yang, like more masculine in archetypal character, and therefore its expression is more direct, outward, and assertive, right? So when we compare this to the evening star planets, Dorotheus talks about these planets wanting to cover and conceal and being more passive. Paulus talks about evening star planets will manifest later on in life. On the topic of electional astrology, Saul talks about planets on the evening side being weaker in general. And Avila talks about this being more discreet, contemplative, and withdrawing, mimicking this feminine archetypal nature. Okay, but this is what that question was pointing to, and this is in Helena Avila's book, and it says that superior planets, so that's Jupiter, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, will be stronger as morning stars and weaker as evening stars, whereas the inferior planets are stronger in the evening phase as opposed to being in the morning. Now, this is based on, the concepts of masculinity and femininity reflecting each hemisphere. But I think astronomically, what happens is that these inferior planets, when they become evening stars, their speed is actually very fast. So that speed will also add into the strength of a planet. Whereas when Venus and Mercury are in the morning star phase, they're quite slow because they've just finished the retrograde phase. So, they're weaker in that concept. So that's the way I like to look at it. And that's the reason why I encapsulate these inferior planets being in its prime when it's risen in the evening skies. And you can see when you look out in the evening, when Venus is an evening star, it is very powerful. She's very visible, and it's all your eye kind of points to in an evening sky if you've ever noticed it. And likewise, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are in the morning side, they're faster, and that tends to add to their strength. Whereas coming out of the evening side, that come out of their retrograde station, and so they're slower, and therefore there's less strength associated to them. So again, I refer you to studying the astronomical cycles. It will then help you inform some of these interpretive principles as well. So an example here, like looking at back to Elon Musk's chart, so we can see that because Jupiter and Mercury are on the evening side, they're considered to be evening stars. So we may, based on this theory, we may say that because Mercury is considered to be an evening planet, inferior planet, that it would perform better as an evening star. So this is Mercury that's about to rise to its prime. Whereas Venus, Saturn, Mars as morning stars, we would consider, based on this theory, that Saturn and Mars, being the superior planets, are more comfortable in that morning side, okay? So what we can glean from this little bit of interpretation is that Mercury and Jupiter themes may be more evident with the passage of time, as what Paulus refers to, and Venus, Saturn, and Mars themes may manifest in his youth, and, obviously we don't really know Elon, but that's one thing that you may like to explore with your clients. That's what I've just said before. So then we get to this idea of like the closeness of a planet to a sun. And this generally is a weakening effect. And we'll go through, we'll really rip this apart and go through the details of this. And just to remind you again, the superior planets will only have this happen once in its cycle, whereas the inferior planets will have this happen twice in its cycle. Okay. And the key idea to think about here is the topic of light and shadow, the topic of luminosity. A planet being closer to the sun will have less light, and less light equals less strength in general. So that's what you want to ask yourself. How much light does this planet actually have, so that I can determine how much power this planet actually has? Okay. So here are some key words. William Lilly in Horary will talk about the significator of a querent if it was under the beams, showing great fear or being overpowered by someone, okay? Because it's the idea of the sun's glare overpowering a particular planet that gives this interpretation. Generally, like as it says in Maternus, that the vicinity of the sun is harmful to all stars. So any stars that are close to the sun generally is overlooked and harmed by the rays of the sun. Demetri George brings in a more mythological interpretation here, and saying that the beams of the sun going into darkness points to this underworld experience, like a shadow experience, okay? And Helena Avila talks about this as removing one's capacity to act, weakening its expression. And this can have good or bad results. So it can either work in your favor or it can work out of your favor, depending on what that planet is and what it represents, okay? And when we talk about things like medical astrology, on Saul's book on treating a patient, he looks at the light of a planet being indicative of the vitality of a planet. So if a person who was sick was not under the rays of the sun, for example, he would look at that as a testimony for recovery of an illness. Okay, so it has a lot to do with our health and vitality. Okay, so the one thing I wanted to point out is about the difference between combustion and the beams is that being in combustion, which is the 8 degrees on either side of the sun, is a more intensified version of being within the beams, which is around 15 degrees either side of the sun. Okay, so a planet, as it gets closer to the sun, becomes more afflicted and weakened. Okay, so combust is essentially a more intensified, debilitated experience of being in the beams. Okay, and the important thing to note is whether a planet is applying to the sun or separating from the sun, because this has a big difference as to what that planet is doing. A planet that's moving closer towards the sun is essentially what Bernardi calls a person falling into a burning fire. So they're heading into the big climax of their major ordeal, okay? Whereas one that's separating from the sun is a planet that, what Bernardi describes this as, someone that's escaped but not wholly free, or a person with a fever that has left a fever, but he's still quite weak and recovering, okay? So always check whether a planet is before or after applying to a sun or separating from the sun, because it will tell you whether that planet is actually heading into more challenges or heading out of the challenge. And this, I see this a lot in charts, and I have an example of this coming up. And halfway through that configuration of being within the beams and being in combustion, there's this Cazimi phenomenon, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, where a planet is within the degree of the sun. Some astrologers consider a shorter orb for that, of 16 to 17 minutes. However, I tend to work with the 1 degree, and I do notice, I do observe the Cazimi interpretations to be true within that 1 degree. Helena Evola talks about this as a planet being able to project itself into the world. If it's dignified, okay? If it's not dignified, then perhaps the Cazimi may accentuate the difficulties. And I must say, I have actually seen this. I've seen a Mars debilitated in Libra being in Cazimi, actually bringing about some challenging situations. However, the challenging situation has led to something beneficial, okay? So it's good to just observe what's happening each time to build your own internal knowledge about that planet. I like to, Bernardi talks about this as like, one falling into the burning fire, coming into Cazimi. But when we see a Cazimi aspect, I kind of picture this like Moses and the burning bush, where God comes out of the burning bush and offers support and protection for the Hebrews in Egypt. That's how I picture a Cazimi to be. Other people picture the Cazimi to be like riding in the chariot of the sun, or having a seat at the king's table and having special gains and offers being available to you. So however you want to picture this archetypal image, that's up to you, but these are just some suggestions. Okay, so I have an example here of, this is a natal chart of one of my clients that, as you can see, its Jupiter is not in great condition. It's a Jupiter in fall. It's in the 2nd house. It is a morning star Jupiter, though, and it has just made its first aspect with the sun. So it's a very youthful, naive Jupiter. So she came to me as a client, and she's a yoga teacher. And I was very impressed by her level of enthusiasm around her business. She's always wanting to learn, always eager to gather knowledge, and despite, any kind of challenges, she was there to try something new. But what she found difficult was her ability to differentiate herself from other yoga teachers, because there are lots of yoga teachers around. And partly this is, to me, that Jupiter in detriment, having to go find alternative ways to be able to be acknowledged. And then COVID came, and the whole challenge of lockdowns made it very difficult for her. She then, took the bull by her horns and set up an online yoga meditation hub, and she sold some memberships, but it was still a very hard slog for her. She did a lot of work and didn't get rewarded much for that work, although nevertheless she still was very enthusiastic about, creating her wealth. And then when she came to me earlier this year, it was a very different story in her solar return chart. Here we see Jupiter again in the second house. So we know a repetition in solar returns in house placement is significant. But this time Jupiter is in domicile, and it's exactly approaching a cazimi. It's, within minutes of approaching a cazimi. And this year she essentially reinvented herself. And think of the Jupiter cazimi being the end of one cycle and the start of a new cycle. She literally started a new cycle, reinventing herself in her soul business. She's now a retreat facilitator. She runs yoga retreats, but it is teamed up by other modalities that she's upskilled on. And she's called her business under the topic of not yoga now, but self-alchemy. And I thought, well, that's such a Jupiter and cazimi statement to make. It's again in her second house. And this year has been the most successful year financially to date in her business. And obviously she has Jupiter in domicile. So this is like a temporary condition of Jupiter that she has access to this year. So you can see how she has been able to tap into the essence of Jupiter cazimi within a solar return chart just for that year, despite having Jupiter in a challenging position in her natal chart. And, there are other considerations around this that we will be going through in our solar return chart in terms of the natal chart is the benchmark for what we can get. So if someone that had a better condition of Jupiter in a natal chart that then had this solar return chart may go to greater heights with their level of success. But nevertheless, in comparison to her natal benchmark, this is still somewhat quite a great success for her, okay? So then when we come back to considering this whole configuration around the beams, combustion, the cazimi, and then leaving the combustion and rising again, the topic of, what degrees has always been difficult for me to get around, because every author has different places for where a planet can rise and set, and when a planet goes into combustion, and how long a cazimi aspect is. And I guess in Demetra's book, she summarizes Maternus in saying that, generally Venus and Mars are visible from 8 degrees to be considered within the beams. Jupiter is 12, Saturn's 15, Mercury's 19. Okay, so that's very confusing. And we all don't really look at stars every day, not many of us. So it's really hard to understand, what is technically considered to be within the beams. As a general rule, Demetra George suggests 15 degrees, and I tend to agree with that. However, I personally have seen Venus at 10 degrees very easily. So I always use 10 degrees for Venus, considered to be within the beams. And Mercury is somewhat of a tricky one. I tend to use 10 degrees for Mercury as well. And this is part of the reason why, that Mercury will somewhat always seem to be within the beams or in combustion. And its cycle is not always the 4 months. Like sometimes it's a bit less than that. So sometimes if we follow the rule of the 19 degrees for Mercury being within the beams, sometimes Mercury might make its maximum elongation around 17 degrees, so it's a little bit tricky to determine, what to do with Mercury. And, it reflects its nature as the cosmic trickster. But when I researched this and read Helena Avala's book, she talks about Mercury being relatively unaffected by the sun's rays. And this, she brings in the topic of temperaments, that Mercury is generally a dry temperament. So therefore, it sympathetically aligns to the dryness of the sun. And because and I think because of Mercury's flexibility and adaptability, it's able to be flexible to the demands of the sun and get by and therefore be relatively unaffected by the beams. And the way I see it is that when we see Mercury being within the beams, it's not like it's all lost, but maybe there might be a little bit of brain fog or mental exhaustion or weariness that comes into its interpretation. Or Avala talks about it as one losing a bit of its objectivity, because the sun taking over rules consciousness and awareness. So I would really look at Mercury being within 3 degrees of the sun being what's more noticeable in the ephemeral world. Okay, so you must observe this for yourself. Start tracking the planets and see, how do you feel when Mercury is, say, 10 degrees from the sun, 8 degrees, 5 degrees, 3 degrees, and you can get this information by yourself by your own personal observations. Okay. So coming back to Elon's chart, this is why I considered it to be a Mercury rise at birth, because it has transitioned from morning star to evening star, okay? It's traveling fast, so it's very strong at this stage. And because Mercury is generally not quite harmed by the sun, it shares its same dry temperament. Sympathetically, it talks to each other. And so I see this Mercury as fairly strong and building in strength. And if you look deeper into, the other factors of essential dignity, you can see that Mercury and the moon share a mutual reception with each other. So, and Mercury is also in its own terms and decans. It is also in aversion to both malefics, and it has an approaching trine to Jupiter. So we could say that this Mercury is pretty well resourced to be able to handle a little bit of glare from the sun. So, while some astrologers might look at that and look at Mercury being in combustion, I would look at this and go, it's separating from the sun, it's about to rise. I would call this a Mercury rise at birth, okay? And sorry, that I should have changed slides before. So then, speaking of rises, this is the next thing that we look at in the cycle, that planets that rise out of the sun's beams and set into the sun's beams, okay? The Greeks called this the phenomenon of phasis. And so superior planets will rise only once and set only once. So rise in the morning, set in the evenings, whereas the inferior planets, because it has 2 conjunctions in its cycle, will rise in the morning and set in the morning, and then it will rise again in the evening and set in the evening as a retrograde planet, okay? And when the planet is rising, it makes a really strong statement about itself, like one that's emerging into the world, which is a calical rise, or one that's withdrawing or closing its doors and going into hibernation, which is the setting, okay? So some key words here. Bernardi talks about a rising planet like someone coming out of a battle, rejoicing in having destroyed and outdated all of its enemies. So he talks about it also as a person that has survived an illness and its health is fully restored, okay? And then when we look at the text from Paulus, he talks about rising planets adding the impact of time to it. So when planets are rising, they tend to be effective in youth, and vice versa for setting, okay? And for me, I always like to imagine a rising planet as someone that is expanding into the world after a period of rest or inactivity or hibernation. So there's a process of going through an outward expression, giving an offering, and somehow becoming very obvious in the environment. And conversely, with a setting planet, these are, to me, very tired planets, planets that are ready to rest and hibernate. Paulus talks about setting planets as those that are ineffectual, unavailing, and insignificant. It's a weakening of the planet. And Bernardi, like I said before, will talk about this as a planet that's about to fall into a burning fire, okay? And so we see that morning rises will tend to favour superior planets because it's masculine in nature, it's fitting of the morning archetypes. And if we know the astronomy of the superior planet, the planet will be faster at that stage of their cycle. And inferior planets tend to favour the evening rises simply because they're fast and direct at that stage. So coming back to the topic of the orbs of when does a planet actually rise or set, we determine, use a guide of around 15 degrees. I like to use 15 degrees for superiors, 10 degrees for inferiors. And because the phasis or stationing point is such a significant statement about that planet, we want to also allow a time orb as well, not just a degree orb, okay? So the week leading up to a station and the few days following a station is what we consider to be a whole entire interpretation of being a planet in station. And Demetra George talks about this in her book as well. There's to allow 7 days from a distance of 15 degrees from the sun. Okay, that is a general guide that you can use. So if you're looking at a natal chart and a planet is, maybe a few degrees short of 15 degrees this distance from the sun, always check the ephemeris or animate your chart to see, okay, when did it actually go 15 degrees? And if it's within 7 days, then consider that a rising or setting or, chart. Okay. So coming back then to my Elon Musk chart, this is Mercury, 6 days away from a 15-degree phasis, but only 1.5 days away from a 10-degree phasis. So this is, to me, a Mercury rising planet from birth. And so given all other factors that Mercury, that dictates Mercury's strength, we can see this as someone bringing his ideas to the world, has a very strong intelligence, but uses it in a very considered, careful and thoughtful way, which I guess engineers do. And I also see evening rise Mercuries as a signature of teachers, mentors, people that transmit knowledge and information, and those that inspire the masses with their intelligence, knowledge, and their wisdom. And we can definitely see characteristics of this in Elon Musk's biography. And the way I view it is that planets that have a condition at birth will tend to have this characteristic signature throughout their whole life. And we see examples of like a Mercury rise example, in things that he does his whole life. Whereas planets that are emerging into a significant phase during the life, we see them as evolving themes that will come to the life with the passage of time, okay? Now, the next phenomenon that we look at is retrograde, and we're all very aware of, retrograde planets. Here are some key words. There's lots of stuff said about it. not so great stuff usually. It's usually around weakening of a planet or the corruption of a planet, so to speak. There are some psychological interpretations of this as retrograde planets being an underworld expression or a tapping into our unconscious shadows. So I won't spend too much time on the keywords of retrograde because I know most of you are quite aware of it. But what I want to focus in on is the actual stations, like the time in which that retrograde or direct planet stops and changes directions, because this is the more significant thing to look for, in my opinion. So stations are essentially the moment in which a planet is standing still, about to change directions. It's a concentrated dose of that planet. And for the week leading up to a stationing planet and several days after, we see this really obviously, the natures of that planet very obviously in our collective zeitgeist. And it's really quite fascinating to watch. So generally the first stations are more considered to be more favorable, weakening than the second stations. That's because the first station is always a planet moving into a retrograde motion. So of this, Lily says that a first station will bring dissolution and destruction, whereas a second station, when it moves direct, will bring a renewing of strength in everything. Ibn Ezra talks about a person moving into its first station, aka going retrograde, someone that's frightened and fearing adversities are coming to him. So there's this feeling of anticipation and dread that comes when you see a planet at its first station. And at the second station, it's like someone hoping for good circumstances to come about. So there is hope in a second station, okay? So, keywords like disobedience, collapse associated with the first station, and a forward movement, moving with more ease coming at the second station when a planet is moving direct. So interestingly, back in Elon Musk's chart, he has both. He has Mars moving into its first station and Jupiter coming out of the second station, okay? So remember, the first station was about dissolution, destruction, challenges being anticipated or collapse, disobedience. If Elon was my client, I would actually look at the progressions and see when exactly did that Mars turn retrograde by secondary progressions. It's usually 1 day equals 1 year. And that will be the time in which we can really see the significations of that first station impact in his life. So I'd be looking for events of the nature of dissolution, destruction, challenges, collapse, and to do with Mars things like his confidence, his assertiveness, maybe the males in his life, his fighting spirit, his level of determination. So there's not much written about his life, but the one thing I did find on researching Elon Musk was that around that time, he moved in to live with his father, a male in his life. And this is a decision that he regretted later. He describes his father as being quite evil. So psychologically, we can look at this process as the beginning of that great ordeal of Mars, like going in to confront his own dragons in life, leading to somewhat of a collapse and disobedience. At that time also, it says that when he was 12, he created a video game and he actually sold the code to a computer magazine for $500. And interestingly, that video game was called Blast Star, which I thought was very Mars indeed, a blasting star. So I can just imagine Elon, butting heads with his father, retreating to his room, doing his nerdy thing and then coming out with a game that probably has something to do with shooting people with a game name like Blaster. So, and if we knew more about his life, I'm sure we could add more to this. But what's important here is that if you have a client that you see is at the cusp of a transitioning phase, like check its secondary progressions to see when exactly did this happen. And the interpretive principles that we've gone through today will really apply to that period of time. And likewise, if we look at Jupiter making its second station, so around the 26-degree mark from where it is when it will start to go direct. And based on secondary progressions, this happens around 27, 28 years of age, okay? And so you may think that around 27, 28 years of age, that this moment of time for him may give him hope, optimism, a sense of moving forward with ease, all these significations of that second station. So maybe you may ask, if a client came to you and you saw this, you may ask a question like, okay, around 27, 28, how did events of that time sort of maybe redefine or give you hope around topics of Jupiter that Jupiter rules, like wealth, leadership, your truth or your meaning in life, what actually happened? And so what did happen is that Elon sold his first startup for a meager $22 million. That was for his 7% share. And it was, prior to this, he was living in a rented office space because he had no money to have his own place of residence. So like what Lily says, that second station is the renewing of strength. And Saul says this is that forward movement of matter with no difficulty. So this is the beginning of his abundance flowing in. So Mars and Jupiter's significant phases doesn't quite happen at birth. It happens over the passage of time, and we can track this through secondary progressions. And this is just confirming what I said before, where if a planet has a significant phase at birth, they're the things to really look out for to describe what the life of that person is. So having that Mercury rise at birth, we can see this manifest throughout his whole life. For example, Elon Musk has had a set of twins and a set of triplets. I thought, wow, that is so Mercury, all these Mercury signatures coming out in his life. Well, he's obviously very intelligent. He's very strategic. He's a business mogul. That's all very mercurial. He also is the owner of Twitter, which is, birds, Twitter, Mercury. And all of his business tend to have this mercurial element to them. So SpaceX obviously is to do with travel. That first business that he sold for $22 million was a Zip2, which is a business directory and maps, navigational maps, online directory thing. PayPal is very transactional. Neuralink, which is his underground travel tunnels, that kind of thing. So all of his life signatures have a very strong Mercury nature. And that's because, to me, he has that Mercury rise at birth. Whereas Jupiter and Mars signatures will tend to switch on when we see these happen by progressions at 12 days for Mars and 26 days for Jupiter. Okay, that's when they switch on in the nature of whether it's the second station or the first station. Okay, and speaking of planets turning direct and retrograde, we had this similar situation happen just last week where Mercury station direct and Saturn station retrograde, okay? And I've just put this over Johnny Depp's chart because within one day of Mercury making its second station, so that station of hope and renewal, a verdict was given on his trial with Amber Heard, okay? Now, the station happened to be exactly partile to the minute of his natal Venus, and this is actually an accurate time of birth for Johnny, so that was a lucky find. And this happened in his 10th house, the 10th house ruling Depp's reputation and career. We see a forward turning, a renewing and hope in his reputation and career. The 10th house in horary also points to the outcome or judgment. So this long drawn out court case happened to have forward momentum the moment Mercury went to its second station. Mercury also rules Depp's second house of finances. So what's actually moving forward is Johnny Depp's finances and livelihood, okay, because that's the planet that's actually making its second station. And I think he won 15 million out of that court case. Mercury also rules his 11th house of friends, hopes, aspirations. So this is giving him extra hope, I guess. And I heard that he threw a party, a post-trial party for all his friends that was worth $87,000, you know, just some casual drinks, which was pretty amazing. Saturn's, at the same time, Saturn made its first station into being a retrograde planet within 3 days of his verdict. And that actually happened on his Saturn return pretty much in the 7th house of defendants in a lawsuit or partners. So Amber Heard is essentially his defendant as well as being an ex-partner. So we see here the idea of Saturn going through dissolution and collapse, heading into its major ordeal in life on the topic in the area of Johnny Depp's partner and opponent. And what house does Saturn rule? Well, it rules the 7th house, so 7th house of relationship, but it also rules the 6th house. And the 6th house can sometimes also mean people working in secrecy against you, and it's also the 8th house from the 11th house of friends, so meaning the 10th of the death of friends, okay? And although I don't consider him to consider Amber Heard as a friend, but she obviously was at some stage. So you can see how you can apply these techniques to a transit chart, to one's natal chart. But then if you know that time of birth, you can look at, okay, what is that planet that's making a significant phasal change? What does that signify in the birth chart? What house does it rule? Where does it end up? And that can add into your interpretation of that planet. So one thing about the inferior retrogrades is that it happens at the beginning of its cycle, okay, and the end of its cycle. So that changeover, that decay stage of ending one cycle and starting a new Venus or Mercury cycle, we'll see the retrograde phase straddle over that. So to me, that planet will also be doing this in between the Earth and the Sun. It's very close to Earth. And to me, I see this as the phenomenon of inferior planets when they go through that retrograde cycle, having matters that are close to the heart, being very painful and being very prominent for that 40 days or 21-day period. Okay, it's a much shorter period, okay? Whereas for the superior planets, the retrograde phase is much longer, like from 4 to 6 months, and it happens in the middle part of their cycle, okay? And this is where we see, I think, the middle part of their cycle being where the planet is actually in opposition to the sun. So I find these retrograde periods tend to be indicative of issues that are external to one that are important to us. So things like societal pressures, governmental decisions, rules, regulations, authorities that we're butting heads against, therefore giving us our big ordeal. It's not the same as a Venus-Mercury retrograde where those matters seem to be more within the heart or stemming from our own emotional nature. This is more the case of planets that are opposing in nature to what's in their environment. So that's the two differences that I see between a superior retrograde and an inferior retrograde. And because superior retrogrades happen in such a long period of time, what becomes more important then is actually the stations rather than the retrograde phase. Whereas for an inferior period, because they are the shorter amount of time when they are retrograde, we can see that, yes, the stations are important, but the whole time tends to be felt more deeply and more intensely than, say, a superior retrograde, okay? So halfway through that superior retrograde cycle, they go through a phenomenon of what we call the Curtailed Passage. This is the idea of planets being opposite the sun, but at dawn and dusk, when the sun is rising or setting, you can't actually see this planet. It's only when the sun sets further down into the horizon and therefore making Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn rise further up into the sky that it only becomes visible. And this is around a 7.5 degree orb from the opposition of the sun that is this phenomenon called the Cattail Passage. And this is the idea of being the climax of the major ordeal of a superior planet, okay? And ultimately, Robert Schmidt talks about this as a point of destabilization. And I think that's what I've seen in terms of there's a shift in power balances there. Retrograde planets coming into that opposition is in a superior position to the sun, so overcoming position to the sun. So that's considered to be more powerful than a planet that's in an inferior position. Whereas once it hits that Curtail Passage and passes over to the evening star side, that planet will be in an inferior planet in relation to the sun, therefore now hurling rays backwards towards there and therefore being weaker. And so this also mimics that theory of evening star phases for Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn not being their ideal orientation to be in. Okay, so we see this example here in Mariah Carey's chart. She was born 5 days before, 5 days after, the sun being in Cazimi, and it's now passed to still be within that 7.5 degree opposition orb of the sun on the evening star side. And from what we know, she had a very poor upbringing, a multiracial upbringing where she really felt the impacts of that, of racism. And so that, to me as well, is a signature of Jupiter being a planet that rules cultures. Let's see, what did she do? She obviously had delays in wealth, Jupiter being weekend, being in the evening, wealth came later for her. And when she did come into wealth, she married the owner of her record company, which was 24 years her senior. And whilst she was very wealthy and she was seen to have this fairy tale wedding and living in a big mansion, she was actually very, this came at a great cost to her own personal authority because her partner was, in fact, very controlling of what she did with herself and how she sang, what she wore, that kind of stuff, okay? So we see here that phenomenon of Curtailed Passage. She's partly invisible. Part of her life was invisible at that stage. But at the same time, she was also receiving great success and fame in another part of her life. So this is that phenomenon of Jupiter only being invisible at sunset and sunrise, but at any other phase of the night sky, when the sun dropped further down below the horizon, Jupiter was in fact very visible. Okay, so can you see how that interpretive idea of, having something hidden at certain phases of your life being very significant here? And Jupiter has a lot to do with wealth and has a lot to do with one's freedom and truth in life. Okay, and there's a lot more we can go into this here, but I'm just cautious of the time. Okay, we're coming into the last couple of interpretive principles here, and this is now only applying to Venus and Mercury, which is the concept of the elongations. So elongations will happen once in the morning and once in the evening for both of these planets. This is essentially another turning point for that planet, a change in perspective of that planet, a planet shifting from getting to its most limits of a situation and having to make a decision to do something else, change its course. Okay, so when a planet is separating from the sun towards its maximum elongation, we consider this as a planet seeking individuation, seeking independence. Whereas when a planet starts to head back towards the sun and apply to it, that planet will now be looking for collaborations, looking to integrate, looking for unity. And that would be somewhat of a maturing experience for it. So the difference between mornings and evening elongations is the fact that morning, coming up to the morning is when it separates, it's youthful, and it gets to this furthest perspective from the sun. It can see the whole situation there. And this is the beginning of its maturity because it's starting to get ready for commitment, which is what Michelle Finey talks about in her book, The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars. You know, this is a youthful planet that's started on its journey, but that's maybe reached the outermost limits of a situation and then needing to then alter its course. And in that process of doing that, it's able to gain a little bit of maturity. Whereas if a planet does this in the evening, it is starting to wind down. It's starting to cull what it has, slow down. It's like old age setting in, or one going into retirement and starting to literally slow down in speed. The planet will literally start to slow in speed at that stage. Okay. Now, one last thing is that I just wanted to quickly raise this in Gary Caton's book, Hermetica Triptycha, and this is specific to Mercury, is that he uses the image of the alchemical processes to illustrate the morning, evening, and Cazimi point of the cycle. So the evening elongation is the nigredo, it's the slowing down, descending below the earth, getting in touch with our subconscious shadows. We're switching from daytime consciousness to nighttime consciousness, and there's a lot of purging that is happening at that stage. This is Mercury in its epithet as the psychopomp. Whereas in the albedo phase, which is the interior Cazimi, the beginning of a new Mercury cycle, this is the sacred union of the rational and the non-rational worlds, the union of opposites that's happening consciously and birthing some kind of a new child from that in the form of a new intention. And we often see people have new intentions come about in a new cycle, okay? Whereas the morning elongation, he depicts this as the rubedo phase, and this is like the reddening phase and an injection of fresh blood into the purified soul, which is what he beautifully encapsulates there. And this is that return back to daytime consciousness and starting to manifest what our journey entailed and what our intention birthed. And so you can look at that. If you wanted to follow the Mercury cycle, you can look at that as quite a fascinating observation in your life. And the interesting thing is here, and this is one of Gary Caton's research findings, is that all 3 points, that is the evening elongation, the inferior Cazimi, and the morning elongation, happens to be around the same degree and sign of each other. So if you look at a Mercury cycle coming up, and we had one that started recently on the 22nd of May, and I think that was around 0 degrees Gemini, you know that wherever that 0 degrees Gemini is falling in your chart for the next 3 or 4 month period of that Mercury cycle, that is what Mercury is essentially alchemizing and working on. So very fascinating study that he's done there, and one that I invite you all to research yourself. So on the topics of case studies and elongations, we see here Carl Jung. He was born one day before a Mercury morning elongation. So I'll consider this Mercury elongation chart. And Venus is, in fact, also quite elongated. It's already had its morning elongation, but it's now starting to set and move towards the sun again. And so we can see characteristics of this in his life, characteristics of having to reach the outermost limits of a situation and having to make a decision, sometimes being quite a painful one, and changing course. Well, one of the most famous things we know about Carl Jung is that him and Freud, who were aligned at one stage, had a big disagreement, and he had to go his own way to establish his own system in analytical psychology. So you can see this as a signature of that elongation, that's showed up in the nature of his life. Now, Mercury also rules his 7th and 8th houses, and we know this is the right time of birth for Carl Jung. Mercury rules the 7th and 8th houses of partnerships and resources. So what is it that's actually changing directions and maturing is the fact that it has something to do with his partner, in this case, his research partners, and shared resources. So the shared resources of the researchers that they've been doing is taking a change in its course, okay? We can also see Mercury rules the 4th and 5th house. That's showing one's maybe level of maturity in one's own self-expression and maybe one's own foundations from which they're working from, also undergoing that elongation phase, okay? So interestingly, I only realized this as an afterthought that both Elon Musk and Carl Jung had a Mercury in Cancer, and both of them had quite a strong Mercury. Both are in their fast phases. Elon's Mercury is probably at a more mature phase than Carl Jung's. Both very powerful. One is at the evening rise phase, one's at the morning elongation phase. And they're both supported by the moon. So Elon had a mutual reception with his moon. Carl had an exalted moon. And if we look at that, we could, just based on Mercury being in Cancer, we may say some similar things, like they were able to connect the dots. The moistness of the Cancer sign is one's ability to mentally connect the dots and draw down conclusions by integrating lots of different aspects together, perhaps, an intuitive mind. But the key difference here is that one is a Mercury in Cancer elongated in the morning, and one is Mercury in Cancer rising in the evening. So what's the difference? To me, I see this as Carl Jung's Mercury being more apparent from birth. So his career actually developed very quickly. I think he did want to be a priest at one stage in his early youth, but he quickly decided to work in a hospital and study psychology. And, like what Paula says, morning planets will be more effective from youth. He tends to be more self-led as well, being a morning planet. He primarily was his own operator. Even though he operated within a network of partners and colleagues, he kind of steered his own course, which is very much a morning star, masculine, self-directed, self-driven characteristic. Whereas Elon Musk, his career to me seems to be a little bit more choppy. It's got the ups and downs, more changes. He was nearly bankrupt a few years ago. He's got lots of different business ventures. Nothing is quite stable and permanent about it. He tends to spread himself out to lots of different partnerships, and he has a lot more conflict with them too. That Mercury, having left the beams, is that kind of Mercury that has been through a lot of pressure. It's just come from the fire. And whilst it survived, it nevertheless still has that memory of conflict, of ordeals, of challenges. And so we see Elon Musk more active in, say, collaborating with venture partners and investors and things like that. He almost relies on them in a way to be able to get his projects going. Well, at one stage he did anyway. I'm not sure if he does now. Okay, so you can kind of glean different characteristics happening here of based on what phasal phenomenon was apparent at their birth. So I just wanted to illustrate that and how you can deepen your nuance of a planet by looking at a phase. So one thing I would suggest, I know it's quite a complex study, but one thing to do is to start observing this in your own life. And I would suggest to choose a planet that's really important to you, whether it's the Lord of your ascendant or your activated and your perfected Time Lord, or another Time Lord that you're using. And literally follow that planet in every day. And to make it easy for you, I've created this ephemeris. I might just stick this link for you in the chat where you can download it. I've done it for all the planets that I've spoken about today, but if you want to, I'll just put it in the chat. You can click on the link and just download, and maybe it's just on an A4 page, so stick it up somewhere, and you'll see your life go through these motions of the phases as it rises, as it sets, as it makes its elongation, if it's an inferior planet, as it's moving into its retrograde, when it's, etc. All these phases that we're talking about, you'll notice these phenomenons happen in your life. And take note of what houses these planet rules in your chart and what houses they're falling in when they're transiting. And that will give you the topics of what's actually falling into a burning fire, or what topic is rising into renewed strength, etc. So that, to me, is the best way to learn what all these phases are. So I would invite you all to really follow this. And if you do write, I do write weekly transit reports, and I really follow this ephemeris as a great way to be able to get a lot of color into what's happening this week. So if you're one to write astrological forecasts, this is a really great tool to use. And I would also invite you to look at your solar return chart and look at the phasal differences between your birth chart and the solar return chart, and feel into what it's like to have that temporary phase and how what difference it's made in your life. And that in itself will be really illuminating and will teach you a lot. And I know this presentation was rather dry, but hopefully with your own embodied learning by following and tracking these planets, you'll be able to get a lot of this information yourself and maybe just come back to this presentation at a later stage, which may make more sense. So that's it for me.